Hello and welcome to Soul Portals, exploring psychospiritual horizons with your hosts Cedric Spire and Deanna Nagel. Cedric is an author and therapist who developed the interview guidance model and is a pathfinder in the psychospiritual realm. Deanna created the Essential Soul Care model, a model suitable for therapists, coaches, and healers. The monthly episodes of Soul Portals feature guests sharing insights from their personal paths and professional practices. Thank you for tuning in for the Soul Talk with all kinds of trailblazing teachers and guides as Cedric, Deanna, and guests explore new evolutionary landscapes.
Welcome again to Soul Portals, and our name invokes that our guests are an opening to psycho-spiritual matters and how their gifts and talents meet the world's need. And today we have a great example of that in Teri. And I like to lead with an opening invocation. And this month is very apt because we have a minister in the room. So may the spirit flow freely through our conversation and this gathering, allowing it to be both energizing and edifying. And then part of our format is an opening quote that has a tie-in to the theme, and this one comes from the Talmud, the Jewish commentary on the Torah. You may know it. It goes like this. Again, think of Teri's vocation. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So now we'll have a conversation about the uncompleted work and how we are not abandoning it.
So, Teri, we're just going to go right to the heart of it. And I'm wondering if you could, I mean, I know your background and your bio is listed on the podcast, but I'm wondering if you could tell us what sense of spirituality, what about that in your growing up years and into your early adulthood made you choose your vocation? Like, what's the spirit behind the work?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. There's it's such a journey, an evolving journey. I think let me begin by just sharing the story of an epiphany that occurred to me during my college years, that I write about in my book, because it was a foundational turning point for me where I I'd always been very very spiritual as a child and growing up, and very interested in at my church, religious stuff, the Bible. But I was also very, very shy, very fearful, just intensely anxious, young person. I still am, really, but I just have learned lots of coping mechanisms now. But and so the religious interest, the spiritual interest, there was always a part of me, but I was um just sort of discarded that as like, yeah, but that's not like, um, I never acted on it, I guess I should say, because I was too afraid to. And I had a moment in my when I was in college. It was either sophomore or junior year, which was, and I was just reading a book, and I can't even tell you what book it was, but lots of my, as you get to know me, lots of my epiphanies occur while I'm reading or writing. And it just dawned on me when I was reading this book. It was about Jesus. It was something fictional, like about Jesus comes back, um, and there was something I read in there that just made me realize that God wanted more from me than I ever imagined for myself. And there was a call there for me to at that point go to seminary after college and just dip my toe into the water of ministry, ordained ministry. And that moment reading that book really turned my world upside down because it scared me to death, really. And I immediately said no. And there's been lots of moments like this where I feel called to something, and I've actually talked about the concept of call with groups, and I worked with college students as a college chaplain, and we talked a lot about the sense of call, and I always advise people to look for the patterns because I think there's unique patterns in the way God or Spirit speaks to us and calls us, and my pattern is often is is an immediate rejection, like, oh no, I can't do that. That's really scary. Um, but then there's the persistence of the call. Like I try to get away from it, I try to close the door, um, but something or someone keeps opening the door after I close it, and the opportunity won't go away, and then it becomes such a terrible thorn in my side that I just sort of give in like, well, fine, then God, I'll try this. But it's not a binding deal. I'm just going to try it, right?
It's
And
like the
that's
story of Jonah and the whale,
it
right?
is. It is. It says I begrudgingly say, fine, I'll go to seminary, but I'm not going to like it, right? But
Mhm.
and 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 so that really led me into pursuing my seminary education, and then um just kept unfolding this call for me. I I think I think vocation and call is something that shifts and changes as you move through life,
Mm.
in terms of what opportunities come into your context.
Mhm.
And you
Yeah.
know, real the space I'm in right now, I mean, I'm now serving as the editor of the Presbyterian Outlook, and one of the threads of my call has always been writing, a love for writing. And I actually, another, if you're familiar with Frederick Buechner, he's a
Mhm.
Presbyterian pastor, but a beautiful writer too. And whenever I would talk to college students about discerning their call or their vocation, I give them what I call the Buechner formula. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Frederick Buechner talks about vocation is finding that place where your deepest joy or
Mhm.
deepest gladness meets the world's deep needs.
Mhm.
And so that has sort of evolved for me, but I feel like right now I'm living into really the truest form of that for me because it brings me deep gladness to write and to um, share my experiences, my thoughts, in a very honest, I believe in being very honest and authentic, and in the hopes that they meet a need in people that where it will resonate, and they'll find something where they can to know they're not alone, and that we together we have shared purpose. Um, and so that's my sweet spot of vocation right now that I'm living into the most. And
You know,
uh
when you say death, it's scared to death,
yeah,
it's like death of the ego,
yeah,
but not death, just another layer of trying to do it on our own steam.
yes,
It's
yes,
actually a relief when another layer goes, right? Because then
right.
you can be carried.
I can be carried, and then um I love that death of ego too, because um there's just, yeah, there's self-pursuit that, as opposed to the pursuit, the spiritual pursuit, the pursuing what you are called to do to meet a need in the world. And and then I think there's my trouble was always the self-negating messages
Mm.
that told me I'm not talented enough for this. Nobody would, I can't do any good there. Um, I can't do this. I can't do this kind of the defeating thing parts, because that's also part of the ego. And uh
That actually brings us to the to your vocation, like the real nature of it, because people get discouraged thinking, well, I can visit some people in prison, but what's that going to do?
yeah,
Right? It's not going to solve the systemic sin in society,
exactly.
but you found a way on the individual level to go to that intersection where you're meeting the people individually in groups, and you're very aware of this, what they call systemic sin.
Yes,
So
right.
that's like your crossroads, and so we're interested in what's that
Yeah,
like to go to those crossroads.
right. Right. Yeah, and it was the first time when and is speaking about again, it was another call moment for me, where I lived in in rural Illinois at the time as a college chaplain, and 15 miles down the road is this men's prison that I drove by all the time and ignored. It was like calling to me, and it was just there was a constant inner dialogue of, yeah, that's that's what's there, but I can't go there. I can't, there's nothing I can do there. And if I do try, I'll get overwhelmed by the need. That was a big part of it. Um, but again, it was a persistent call that yeah, I just got sick of myself. So I had to and then it
Mm.
snowballed into this huge thing where I was like, wow, I should write a book about this. So, yeah.
And so that's how I first came to know of you,
Mm.
through your book. Um, and I had said earlier to you, your book showed up at a necessary time, and the book is entitled Necessary Risks. So this was during the pandemic. Everybody's on lockdown. Um, and I've been a counselor for 1,000 years, and I decided to get my doctorate in multi-faith spiritual direction. And
Wonderful.
so the program was very diverse. And we learned about all sorts of spiritual practices and religions, et cetera, of the world. And in the backdrop and the forefront, and especially in the United States, was all of this turmoil around race and equity and inclusion. And I was on the board of the Florida State University Presbyterian Ministry, which is an inclusive ministry on campus, one of the safe spaces on campus. And it was also, I'm of an age now, so I struggled with pronouns. Like, okay, how do I do this? Even though in my heart I feel completely inclusive and
Mhm.
accepting, it was another learning curve for me. It was all a learning curve for me. Um, and then your book showed up, and I got to sit in on a talk with you. And
Oh,
it just really, yeah, you invited all the UKirk
oh yeah.
campus
Mhm.
ministers, and because I was a board member, I came. But this book just was so it, it wasn't a difficult read for one. You told your story and then you gave like, okay, here's my story. If you want to do something, here's some action steps you can actually take.
Mhm.
So I just
Yeah.
can't thank you enough for this book.
Thank
Could
you.
do you say a bit about the title? So, which is at the core, the necessary risks and
Unnecessary risks.
ones you took and the ones you recommend. Yeah.
Yeah. So well, there's a process to publishing a book. You have to find a message that resonates, and that a publisher will buy. And there was many iterations of the book. It really started sort of more memoir-like about my experiences. But I had an acquisitions editor at Fortress who said, what I'm really looking for is a book on risk. And I said, oh, that's something I have something to say about because I feel like God just continuously calls me to take risks, and um, it drives me crazy. It makes me highly anxious, but it has led me to a meaningful life and wisdom and knowledge that I never would have had I not taken certain risks. And so each chapter is focused on a different risk that I believe, especially, and I often think like my audience, I joke, but it's kind of true, is like white anxious women like me who who want to do good and who understand that there are problems and that we have something to contribute, but are sort of just afraid of um, not only you know, making mistakes, or not being able to do good or contribute, but I am always afraid of doing harm. If I one of the risks is risk speaking. If I, even this podcast, I'm like, oh my gosh, I am a white privileged woman. I'm going to be going on this podcast and I'm going to be talking about race, and I am going to get something wrong because it's it's not it was never a part of my vocabulary. Um I was privileged to not I didn't have to deal with racism growing up. And so there's so much I don't know and so much I can't know. And so there is a real fear of sort of wading into even this dialogue and feeling like, I'm gonna make a mistake. Um, but what I've learned in the process of sort of pushing myself to take risks, to risk speaking, to risk going, for me that was risk going to the prison,
Mhm.
or risk going and reaching out to the African American students on my college campus, or the Latino students, risk actually physically going to places and people that were different than me and had different life experiences. Risk learning, like
Your
learning.
answering question just came up in the chat, like a particular examples of risks that you took. So,
Yeah. Oh, good. And
yeah.
um, yeah. So these risks, I just share categories of risk taking and then sort of the ways I struggled through those risks and then really benefited. I mean, the book for me, again, writing is the way I learn. Um, and just the writing of the book itself was a process of learning, and I will also say a process of liberation. I believe education is liberation, and it's that um, because I know so much more now, having taken risks and really gone places and delved into materials that I wouldn't have previously. I'm a different person than when I first started the journey that was the book and even before it. So, yeah.
There's a follow-up question about what is being risked. So that sounds like a good therapist question. Like, when somebody's anxious or fearful, to run them through, well, what would happen if you went in that direction? If you did this, then what? The
Yeah.
then, if so, then what question? I think that's where it's coming from. Like, what did you have to lose?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to I think we have a tendency to catastrophize. At least I do. And so we think of the worst, in my head, if I go to this men's prison, I'm gonna get stabbed. There's gonna be a riot.
That's a good example.
Right. And then I go, and yeah, it is scary. I'm a little claustrophobic. There's a lot of locked doors. You can't get out. You don't have a cell phone. I mean, I'm not gonna say it wasn't uncomfortable, but yeah, but I also, once I was able to negotiate what was going on in my mind and the messages my fear was telling me, and I made it in, I met the most beautiful human beings that are locked up inside our these walls. Um,
Mm.
yeah, in the
And
And
underbelly of our society. Yeah.
and
and
something
in sorry, go ahead, Deanna.
that that's a big risk that, and I think all the risk, as you've said, there's fear underlying the risk, whatever
Yes.
the risk is. So even when I was working, mission work at the campus ministry, and I didn't know my pronouns, right? The risk is that for me was that people were going to assume I didn't care or I was not as inclusive as I claimed to be.
Hmm.
So I was afraid to ask. I was
Mm.
afraid to become informed within the community I was working.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Terry, did you ever have a bad experience where someone confronts you and says, "Who are you this even talk about this, a privileged white woman?" Did that ever happen?
Um, like I I have yes, so I have there's a couple talking about Ray. I've had lots of different experiences now as I've kind of toured with the book and talked about the book. And um well, first of all, I should say in my contract with Fortress, I negotiated to have a sensitivity reader. I said, I'm not going to write this book if I don't have a person of color read it and give me feedback on it. You know, it was very important to me, and it remains important to me that I listen particularly to people of color, or people from other marginalized communities who have feedback for me. Um, and I have encountered that as I've talked. Um, and so and I always make sure I make space to really, within my spirit even, to receive that feedback, um, and uh, not there's a the white fragility is the one of the you know problems in conversations about race, where white people just cannot hear the feedback from people of color, and it react defensively, and that fragility was definitely within me. But I have come to realize I know how much I don't know. This is my truth. And so, but it is also, there's a questioning about what is a particular risk I've taken as a white woman. Um, but I am committed to the risk of speaking. Um, and my risk really is literally opening my mouth in conversations like this is 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 a risk because I will get things wrong, and I should be corrected if I get something wrong. And I'm much less fragile now because I've been putting myself in these spaces where I have to open my mouth and say something. Um, but the alternative for me is the understanding that staying silent is does nothing to it actually aids the oppression, right? Um it's not I talk about how silence is not neutral. Elie Wiesel has a great quote about, um, you cannot stay silent in the face of oppression. It's like the moving sidewalk, right? As a white privileged woman, I am on the moving sidewalk, and if I do not moving me forward, and if I don't speak or say anything against the system that we are all moving forward on, then I'm just benefiting from the system and not doing anything to disrupt it or say. So it's not neutral. My silence is not neutral. And so it's really very important to me that I open my mouth.
Yeah.
And even if what comes out is ineloquent, even if I make mistakes, it is very important for me. Like Deanna, with your example too of the pronouns, to just like, and because I've also been in I remember one conversation at a in a class where this was at the very beginning of my journey where I was not opening my mouth, and we were having a discussion, and there was a young a black male student who was really speaking up kind of passionately in a room full of white people. And I just sat there in silence because I was, and that I think this happens, frankly, to white people. We don't know what to say or do, so we do nothing and we freeze.
Mm.
We want to be helpful, but we just freeze and we get paralyzed. And and I'm thinking, right, well, he knows this black student knows that I'm an ally, right? He knows I'm with him, but how does he?
Right.
Unless I say so, unless I open my mouth and just to say, even if I just open my mouth enough to say with a quivering voice, I hear you, I'm listening to you, I'm with you. I don't have the words right now to respond, but I know I just want you to know that I'm hearing you and listening to you and I'm with you, right? So, um, because when we don't speak up, there's just so much. We
Mm.
just relying on everybody's assumptions.
How do you get past like this cycle of anger and guilt, so that like that's what comes to me when you speak. I'm thinking, well, it could be like just anger and guilt playing off each other, which wouldn't be constructive, or
Yeah.
maybe it would, but
Do you mean anger and guilt within myself
no, I mean in the dynamic.
in the
You
dialogue
know?
and stuff?
Yeah, yeah. Like
Um,
the angry side of, you know, the systemic sin, and then the guilt side of being part of
yeah,
it. I don't
yeah.
see that, like I see that as kind of impasse. So
Right.
how do you get past that?
Um, I I always well, in one sense, I've had let me speak to it for both sides. There's times when I've been very angry and I have to not speak out of my anger and calm myself. And there's emotions that can take take me out of my best self. On the other side of that, I have I have heard and in dialogues on race, um, uh, you know, people of color speaking loudly and passionately from um, great frustration, understandable frustration, and then even rage at the injustice and at not being heard for so long. And so it's really important to me to have knowledge, one, to not tone police, right? That's a big thing, big learning of mine, that
Mhm.
there's a reason there is all that, the anger, the rage is there. There's real justifiable reasons, and there's stories underneath these emotions. There's context, there's history, there's generations of trauma living in bodies that comes out when we talk. And so it's always, so when you hear someone,
Mm.
you it's really important to try to take that whole context into
Yeah.
play
Let's so
and
hold the space,
Yeah.
yeah, hold the
basically.
space and receive the whole person.
Yeah.
Because
That's a great
yeah, it might just be words that are being fired at you.
yeah.
There's but there's layers underneath those words.
That's a
And
great expression. First time I've heard it, tone police.
Yeah, tone policing.
And that happens a lot in marriages and partnerships.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
yeah, and it's also about not, when you're faced with an interaction or observing an interaction, not taking it personally,
Yeah.
removing the bias, being the curious observer,
hmm
um, hearing the whole story, not just one part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Yeah, and um and what it really, it does really take a a great sense of sort of, I talked about an interiority. There's a, I have to continually monitor what is going on within me in order to authentically be in relationship and dialogue with others. Like, um, I'll be getting ready to have a conversation, or I'll be start to feel anxious. And I have to really examine my emotions and understand where they're coming from, in order to be my best, um, to, you know,
Mm.
to be in that conversation in the best, most authentic, most hopefully healing way that I can be. Um, so a lot of this work that I'm involved in is, it really is at its core an evolution of self, of coming to understand ourselves, how we react to others, why we react to others the way we do, particularly if the other is someone who is different than us, um, from a different culture, a different life context, different class. There's many forms of privilege.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
yeah,
You just described like a central principle of therapy. It was a good description that you just gave of that. To be self-aware enough to be able to hold whatever the dynamic is in the client
right,
and to
right.
realize it influences them according to the other principle of attunement, to be
Yeah,
able to do the attunement.
mm,
Yeah. That
right. I remember too, in my pastoral counseling classes, we always talked about having a non-anxious presence, um, which is terribly difficult for me because I'm a very anxious person. But but if I can sort of get some distance on those anxious emotions to what's underneath, then it really does help me to be less anxious, and then I'm much more courageous. Then I am a lot, and then I find that there is courage in me. I think there's
Hmm.
courage. I think there's courage in all of us, but it's like it gets covered up by a lot of junk,
Yeah.
or just cultural messages, um, messages we send ourselves, messages we send about others. We quickly write people off
Mm.
as opposed to really seeking to get to know them in their context.
Well, you have the advantage of the Holy Spirit flowing through you at all times, right?
Yeah, a great guide. Yeah, the spirit of truth and wisdom. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, can you talk a little bit about the different types of privilege from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really important to define terms. And when I speak of privilege, um, I also I define it sort of as unearned advantages that people have. Um, but there's professor at Yale University, Claudia Rankin, um, who writes these beautiful books. She's a poet and an artist, and she talks about there's a way she talks about privilege as understanding it as when sort of problems or issues that don't interfere with your reality. So uh, mass incarceration is a huge issue that I am interested in. I'm a person who believes in a justice or believes in seeking justice, and I think our criminal justice system is um, hopelessly in need of really it's a mess. Um, and and yet the issue of mass incarceration didn't interfere with my reality because I didn't know anybody who was incarcerated, until I went to the prison. And so it never, that issue never affected my life. Poverty really doesn't interfere with my reality because I have enough money to buy food and shelter. And there's also the privilege, when we talk about wealth inequality, we need to acknowledge inherited wealth that white Americans enjoy in much abundance over our African American Americans due to the history of our nation. Um, so there's class privilege, there's racial privilege. Um, I do not have to worry. I don't give my children the talk if they get pulled over by a police officer. Um, I actually often think about my privilege when I'm driving. It's something. If you all have ever as a white woman living in the United States, you know how everybody like goes somewhere and forgets their wallet or their driver's license at some point in your life. I did that recently, and so you like, oh, I need to drive really carefully on my way home, like extra careful because I don't have my driver's license with me, but I have to get home and you don't realize it until you're out. And it's those kind of moments where I like, if I were a black person driving and I forgot my license, I just think about these things now so much.
Mm.
I, it, it's a whole next level of anxiety and fear that, I pretty much presume that if I get pulled over, I'll get a ticket or I'll get off because I look like this. Um, and it's just a whole different experience for people who are black or brown from immigrant communities in the United States right now. So those are the kind of things I think of now when I'm living my life. Um, about how there's just some things that are easier for me, and there's more opportunities for me. I've read about Black families choosing a more sort of white name for their children so that they'll have better advantages when they put it down on a resume. You know, I mean, those are the things I don't have to think about. Um, and that's a lot of privilege.
Yeah, and I guess one example I recently was aware of, and I think that's part of it, is just being intentional and being aware. Um, my local doctor's office, I live in a rural county next to a larger metropolitan area. Um, and they ask every patient during the intake, do you have enough food to eat? And that's, not something I have to personally worry about.
Mhm.
But I did have the experience many years ago of working a food pantry
Mm.
for a neighborhood and feeding 50 families on a Saturday morning.
Mhm.
So without having had that lived experience, that question would have just gone right by me. No, I'm good.
Yeah.
Next. Yeah,
And then and the reverberations of not having enough food to eat. It's just, you know, can't concentrate, moody, I mean, I get so cranky if I'm hungry, right? But I got food everywhere. You just think about the, I'm just often kind of going through the steps too of what life would be like trying to, put myself in the shoes of someone that doesn't have enough food to eat.
right.
Yeah, that's seems to be what it's all about, right? Walk a mile in the other person's moccasins.
Yeah. And then
I
work,
mean,
do something with that knowledge to help make our world a little more just.
yeah, the way I connect with it, the kind of empathy you're talking about is the male female situation because I've never thought anything of like walking through dark alleys at night. Like
Mhm.
really, like it doesn't even cross my mind. You know, maybe dangerous parts of the city, maybe, but there's something that women always have to be mindful and think about,
Yeah,
right?
right. Mindful of where we walk, what we wear.
And I mean, race isn't such the big thing in Canada. I mean, it is we have it, but race is a broad spectrum anyway, so
Yeah,
it's
right.
not just about African Americans. So I
Right.
guess we do have it. But I
Yeah.
had experience. I don't know what it means. I'll just tell you. So it's downtown Montreal when I was younger, and these three black guys like surrounded me. All three of them were like I had to look up because they're all much bigger than me, and like just surrounding me, and obviously intimidation. And they said, we need $20, and I said, you see the story is that I was completely relaxed. And
Hmm.
I said, so do I. And they all cracked up and left me alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I mean, I guess I didn't perceive them as the enemy or the monster. I didn't act that way, like they were the enemy or they were the threat. Like, you know, I just kind of, jived with them and they got it
Yeah.
immediately.
There's
And it could have been three men of any color or race.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were
There's
using the image to intimidate me. It was a bit different if it was white men. The whole approach would be a little different.
yeah, right.
They were really relying on me being afraid of the other in that form.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat. Is there data to support the notion that Black families are changing their children's names to more English sounding names?
I don't
Because
have,
the, yeah,
oh yeah. I don't have Dad, I have heard
Me
that.
too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Or read that somewhere. And um but and black families, there's many, and this is me reading black writers. I'm very intentional about and that's why my book is centered on the thought on a different thought leader of color. I'm very intentional about reading um their words, and because my education has been predominantly white. My throughout my master's degree and my doctorate, I've been ensconced in white scholarship and white writers, and that that was something I didn't really wake up to until late in my life. And so the whole um, the whole year I was writing the book, I made an agreement. I said I'm just going to read thought leaders of color. And so these things come from reading their work. And it's certainly been said over and over about Black families having the talk with their
Yeah.
children about what to do, where to have their hands if
Mm,
they are pulled over by the police in this country.
Yeah.
right. And
Um,
the police need, somebody mentioned about the training
yeah.
needed for the police to not be so trigger happy.
Yeah,
I mean, both with race and with mental illness is another one to
right.
Right.
You know,
to recognize what they're dealing with and not react to it.
yeah. I I might pull it off my shelf if I can run. But the the another book I really recommend is Resma Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands. If you all are he studied under Bessel van der Kolk, who is sort of a leader, and he wrote The Body Keeps the Score
Yep.
on trauma.
Okay.
And but Resma's book, My Grandmother's Hands, is all about our, like, really our embodied racism. And Cedric, even you talking about, I was thinking about as you were talking about when you walked into this group of three Black men, you know, I'm constantly at work at how it's not just what's in your head, but it's how your body is responding to people who are different. Um, I am much more conscious now of, I grew up outside Detroit. I was taught to fear Black people. There are all these
Right.
cultural messages, myths about Black people that I was taught. So if I saw a Black man on the street, my body would
Right.
instinctively react, and I
Or
clutch
contract.
or
Yeah.
cross the other side.
Yeah.
Um, and
It's a
there's
basic, yeah, the basic bodily feeling of contracting, protecting, or
yes.
opening and being available. So,
Yes, so it's
yeah.
Resma Menakem is the name of the author, My Grandmother's Hands. And what's really beautiful about his book is that he also goes into because he's about healing. We have to heal from our trauma. This is racial trauma that lives, and we're really learning a lot more about trauma and how it's passed from generation to generation. And he includes police officers in this book, right? So
Okay.
police officers, their work is traumatizing. They are in life and death situations. And
Mhm.
and what I loved, it was a real compassionate approach to saying we need to allow police officers to get the healing, the space and time they need after a traumatic incident so that they aren't trigger happy, so they can work through
Mhm.
the embedded trauma in their bodies, and so we can all be safer because of that.
Yeah.
um Really beautiful book.
Mm.
And I think, isn't it Vanderkolk who says that trauma actually changes the cellular structure within our bodies?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I think he's one of the
Yeah,
founding thought leaders on that. So,
yeah, definitely is. um
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
Everything you're
excited.
saying, sorry,
Oh no, go ahead.
everything you're saying just clicked because I worked in psychiatric emergency where the most psychotic people or deranged would come in. And that's another other, right?
Yeah.
Another feared other is um mentally ill or right? And it's
Right.
always associated with danger.
Danger. Hmm.
So that's where I practiced because, I developed a reputation that when I was on duty, nothing would happen. There would be no violent incidents, and all I did was just relax bodily
Yeah.
and not perceive them as the other. So it's like, okay, you're mentally ill, like so am I. You just happen to be further along the scale at this moment.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
thing is, I didn't even have to say that. That was like the self-awareness you're talking about. I
Mhm.
would believe it, I would relax, and they would get the message without me saying that, right?
Yeah.
They'd feel it and they'd relax and things would be fine on the ward.
Right. Right. And you did, I mean, they talk about, how to de-escalate
Yeah,
situations, and that our police officers really need to be trained in how to
yeah,
de-escalate
yeah. But,
situations. And that's a big part of it, right?
right. Yeah,
If you're
there's like
walking
it's
in,
such a talk about
yeah,
a need in society
mhm,
because it's so interior and I
yeah,
mean going by the stereotype of police, they're not the most introspective people by the caricature.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's a real need though, like what we're talking about for them.
right, right.
Yeah.
There's a question, and we have about 5 minutes, so I just want
Yeah.
to, what is your view on D'Angelo's work?
That's a great question. I personally have been really informed by Robin DiAngelo's work. And so I've found great benefit from it, but I've heard, and again, this goes to listening to people. I've heard the criticism of Robin DiAngelo by people of color who've said that she hasn't given credit to the learning that she has acquired from the people of color that she works with, and so I hear that and I recognize that. I can say I've benefited from it, but um I think there's more self-reflection on her part to be done and more work in that respect too.
As we're winding down, what's the thing that has surprised you most about this stage of your life?
Gosh. Um that I get invited to do things like this. And that I have I do. I get I realize how much I love to learn. That's just a really I'm very I get excited to learn. I get excited about growing as a person and trying to become a better person. And I think what's um constantly surprising to me is when others kind of benefit from what what I have to
Mm,
say, right? And it's it's all just in the hope to contribute to good. Um, and you know, it is truly because the more I learn, the more I realize I know so little. It's
mhm,
it's the I you know I I come to these spaces incredibly humble because there are people on the Zoom who know a lot more than me. But it just feels good to know that I do have something to contribute. Spirit leads me to that. And it's important that I don't stop that flow, right?
mm. Yeah,
So,
good answer. And your hope for the world that's in such a mess now?
hmm.
With 3 minutes to go, what's your hope for the world?
um, I'm just gonna say I'm doing a lot of work on the concept of beloved community,
Mhm.
and what Martin Luther King meant by beloved community, which is we 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 make that concept a lot smaller than it really is. I mean, it is all of us together, living together, even those we consider our enemies. And it's reconciliation, it's peace and nonviolence, and it's nobody's excluded. So it's really hard work, in other words, but
Hmm.
it's that place of evolution where we can learn to live together and love together, and that's my hope for us.
Yeah, amen to that.
That's awesome.
Somebody says, thank you, very thought-provoking hour.
Thank you.
And
Thank you all for tuning in.
and feeling and listening hour.
Yes.
So the right, we got the 10:59. It's mostly thanks in the chat. And
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
so the closing blessing just for you is, may you be under God's grace, safe in her care, and
Mm.
trusting his guidance.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Cedric, Deanna. Appreciate the conversation, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Thank you for being here.